like to welcome you all to this book launch by first acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq peoples. I am a settler on this land and acknowledge that we need to do better to respect the treaties of peace and friendship. We encourage all of you on the call to recognize the original peoples of the land you are on and reach out to those organizations doing work in your area with First Nations to connect with them and make donation towards their work. We will be making a donation to the Mi'kmaq Taplutahan. They are a nonprofit organization whose members are the 9 Mi'kmaq communities in New Brunswick. Amanda will share their website in the chat if you'd like to take a look. So welcome to all of our guests. We're really excited to share this book with you. My name is Natasha Reddy. I am the Director of Communications for All In, a human-centered design agency located in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. All In has partnered with New Lab, a social innovation lab located also in New Brunswick, as well as In With Forward and Degrees of Change to bring you this presentation. So we have Amanda from New Lab. She can give a wave. She'll be assisting with tech today. And Tiziana, she can give a wave. She'll be recording the session for us. Again, as I mentioned before, if you prefer to not be recorded, please leave your camera off. And again, please feel free to eat your lunch. You know, it's lunchtime for lots of people. If you are using a company Zoom account and you'd like to change your name so we know who we have in the room, just click the 3 little dots up on your picture and you will have the option to rename yourself. If you'd like to put your name, maybe your organization. And also if you want to make the speakers bigger, you can switch your view to speaker view instead of gallery view. So Amanda is going to start to share her screen now. We're going to do a quick poll of who is in the room. So with your phone or computer, go to the website. It's a Mentimeter. Amanda will pop that in the chat along with the code. So if everyone can go to the website. Just want to see where everyone is calling from. Welcome to those who have just joined. Toronto, Halifax, Moncton, Fredericton, Vancouver. Oh, UK, Moncton area. Texas, Port Moody. Lots of different areas. Well, welcome everyone. As I mentioned before, for those of you who are just joining, we are recording this session. And if you'd prefer to not be recorded, please just leave your screen off. More people coming in. And then if you can move to the second question.
Good.
Yep. Which best describes where you work? So where are you coming to us from? And as we begin today's session, if you think of any questions for our authors, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them a little bit later within the session during our Q&A. Awesome. Lots of provincial government, nonprofit, consultant. Very cool. Welcome, everyone. Hey, thank you, Amanda. I think if everybody could actually keep that screen up, we will have another question at the very end of the session. So it's the 3rd question. If you continue going. And so now I'd love to introduce our authors of the Trampoline Effect, Gord Tulloch and Dr. Sarah Schulman, calling us from the West Coast. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much.
Yes.
So tell us, what's your story? How did you two meet and start working together, and to come along and create this wonderful book, this new resource?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Natasha and Tiziana and Amanda and Jules for hosting the conversation. We're really appreciative. And yeah, our how we met story, well, I always say it starts with wine. It starts with the spilling of wine, more precisely. You know, I run an organization called In With Forward, and at the time we were based in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And I came for what I thought would just be a quick conference in Victoria. And some of you might know Alec Mansky. He was really the matchmaker in Gord and our story. Showed up at an event, spilled some wine. Gord came over, the kind person that he is, to help me clean up. And we started having a conversation. And it was in that single conversation that I certainly knew there was a different leadership happening, some different conditions, some different questions being asked. And I'd spent, you know, the last 15 years or so traveling around the globe, working with governments in Australia and New Zealand, the Netherlands, the UK, and with organizations, and really seeking out a space where there was the possibility to disrupt things, to transform the ways we think. And that's hard. We've done a number of different large design projects and felt disappointed by the results, felt that we weren't getting the uptake that we wanted, felt that change wasn't becoming embedded enough. It was still kind of project level work rather than actually changing people's lives. And so Gord had the questions that I thought were the right questions to be asking. And we found ourselves a few months later rolling our suitcases into a social housing complex in Burnaby, BC, and our team literally moving in to this new community to start to get to know our neighbors. And so began 5 years of work.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for sharing. So, how do we shift our social systems towards equity and well-being?
Gord, you want to?
That's just,
That's
just
question.
so
I'll take
cruel.
the matchmaking
Yeah.
question.
Well, yeah. That's right. We gotta, yeah. I mean,
Maybe, Gord, you can give a little context of yourself as well before we dive into that question.
Oh, well, you know, I guess, I don't know, like my story's, I think, a lot less interesting than Sarah's.
Always undersell your, that's not true.
No. I sometimes feel like I'm the cliche kind of a monk, you know, that does all this thinking in the cave, or the feeling and stuff like that, and then writes about great ideas and sucking the mirror out of life and all sorts of things, but doesn't have a story to tell so much. But my background is actually, I thought I was going to be in philosophy. That was my pursuit. That was my ambition. That's what I was doing at the time. I was studying and teaching, and took a part-time job working with people with disabilities, because I thought that would be interesting and worthwhile. And it gradually just pulled me in for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I sort of, I ended up kind of moving up through the organization, doing some change within the organization, kind of new programs and services, closing some stuff. I went over to education and was a college instructor for a while. And they're kind of also looking at kind of introducing new credentials and new curriculum. And then I was an accreditation surveyor for a while. I did some, some new program standards and programming and areas. And I guess at the end of it is just feeling like there wasn't anything really changing or shifting, that there's a whole lot of intransigence. And I kind of walked away. I was still employed. At the time, they moved me to the director of innovation. And I kind of stepped away from all my committees. I stopped reading government reports or sectoral reports. I stopped participating in conferences, and because I started realizing that we were in an echo chamber and kind of needed to think differently and look elsewhere. And so, of course, that's where I stumbled into you, Sarah. I don't know who did the stumbling, but it was yeah. And then I don't know. So this question though, like, I got to tell you, like, it's a hard one, especially in the contemporary sort of context that we find it. And part of me wants to say, like, actually, I don't know. I mean, there's I think the equity thing is going to be particularly challenging just because of the very sort of structure of systems. I think kind of the more complicated and mature they are, the more they start accumulating power and diffusing it, and all these sorts of different roles and processes and alliances, and it makes it really resistant to change or to sharing or ceding power. It doesn't really have a capacity for that. I think too, like the more they do mature, the more they require this homogeneity, the sort of sameness and consistency, which means they are more likely to ignore differences, and because they can't deal with all the differences. And yet, when we talk about equity and well-being, we're talking about concrete individuals in concrete contexts, and those differences matter. And then, of course, like you alluded to earlier too, or in the acknowledgement, is that these systems are built on the logics of a particular culture, a dominant kind of white settler culture, which has a very different worldview, I think, than that of First Peoples or other cultures. And of course, I'm sorry, I'm just going to bum you all out for a moment. And systems also, they naturally kind of prefer stasis and equilibrium, which makes it even, I think, more difficult to move towards equity. However, Sarah and I, have been trying to struggle a little bit with this, and I mean, I think one of the things obviously is systems continue to sort of function the way they do because I think everyone's sort of just doing their job in it, and I think there's something to be said for recognizing sort of our own kind of moral responsibility and our own moral complicity in the way things are. And that, I think, allows us to sort of transcend the professional role a bit and assume kind of a more moral responsibility for that. And when I think we create that sort of moral imperative that it's not okay the way it is, and we have a kind of a personal responsibility around that, I think it also creates a moment of instability in the system. Suddenly the weight of the system lightens a little bit. It's kind of, I think, a liberating. And I've been thinking lately, and I'd probably go, so far as to even say that that love could and should be recovered as sort of a cornerstone of social care, because I don't think it can suffer inequity and exclusion. I think it's compelled to attend sort of the well-being of others, and that people achieve the fullness of their being, and it won't put a system or a rule above people. And I don't know, I mean, maybe one more thought is just purposes are super important, because I think systems kind of, they coalesce around a set of purposes, and they try and just get better and more efficient at delivering them. So if you change the purposes, I think you can change what it tries to do. And of course, in our case, we're recommending that they coalesce around purposes that are intention, because I think it makes them less likely to harden into structures that are single-minded and inadequate to the sort of complex landscape that we inhabit. I don't know, I have some other thoughts, but I'm kind of interested to see what Sarah says.
No, I mean,
anything to add, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that our system is in many ways performing exactly as intended, because it was designed for a different purpose. And, I think the welfare state, and more broadly, if you back up and look at the history of welfare in terms of charity, and understand, at least in a Western context, the ways in which we have conceptualized what the job is to be done, it's a profoundly different job than the job of love, and the job of reciprocity, and the job of flourishing. We have always designed our social care systems so that they would be a very basic minimum standard. So we could protect people from harm and protect people from risk and the contingencies of the modern lifestyle. And so, really the history of the welfare state and the ways we've conceptualized social care systems is the movement into cities, and the need at kind of a population level scale to attend to all the bad stuff that can happen to you, whether it's unemployment or sickness. And we have looked at those kinds of risks and situations as the things that we need to kind of manage. And in doing that kind of managing, we've lost sight, I think, of what actually care is all about. So if we want to reclaim our systems to be about well-being and equity, the first thing is we have to intend our systems to do that. And really reckon with what those things mean in practice. And Gord's beautifully described what does it mean to reckon with equity, means reckoning with the myriad of ways in which our powers show up, and the roles and relationships that we have. And you know, the second story of the welfare state and social care is the story of professionalization. So you've got the story of kind of industrialization and trying to protect against risk, and then you've got this need to start to create a whole series of professions, which, you know, now if you look in the catalog of, you know, the CRA and tax things, there's like over 40 different social care professions, housing workers, addiction specialists, you name it. And these kinds of creations of these fiefdoms of professionalization has separated us from many of our moral responsibilities and created codes of ethics which are rigid and brittle, and are protocol driven, and in many ways are the opposites of discernment and love. And so, you know, I think beginning to reimagine what we mean by professionalism, what we mean by boundaries, and repurposing what our systems are for, those two things together can open up a space for moving in that direction.
So a question about beginnings and undertakings. On page 58, the book talks about being engrossed in only grand things. We underappreciate and under-resource the small things, which can be mighty. On page 15, there's also a mention of system change will come from the accumulation of small changes. So how can we tell whether we're working on small changes that will affect system change versus small iterations that will continue to support the status quo?
Such a nice question, because I do think that part of the discourse around innovation is this assumption that it needs to be big and bold and shiny in order for it to be new and different. And I think the work that Gord and I have leaned into over the last 5 years has been much more about recognizing that the axes of change come in moments and interactions, that it's not about the new app, it's not about the new kind of casing on things. It actually comes down to how we show up with one another, the ways in which you know, a community member or a neighbor interacts with a person that is street involved, or the ways in which folks that come with labels or diagnoses that the system ascribes interact with the rest of the world. And that those things do need to get rooted into the particularities of our relationships and our moments. And so I think that the difference between small things that have transformative potential and small things that replicate the status quo are maybe three things. One is, you know, whose logic is being perpetuated when we're creating that small thing, whose problem is that new small thing, that new practice trying to solve, and for whose ends, who's setting the outcomes of those things. So, you know, an example that I often use because I see it so frequently, you know, is, new case management systems, creating some sort of app or some sort of new digital platform for professionals in the system to get organized, to coordinate things, and that being considered, you know, broadly innovative. Well, if we, you know, kind of talk about, well, whose problem is that solving? Not solving a problem that is a system manufactured problem about how it keeps track of things. Whose logic is underpinning that? Well, it's all sorts of logics around information, and information is power. So who holds information about you? So that's a professionalized logic. And then whose outcome is it after is also after a system outcome. And so, you know, if you flip that and start to ask some significant, you know, kind of critical questions about that practice, which is, you know, actually what kind of information do we collect? Who's privy to that information? Why have we constructed systems in which information about people is only given access to some, and actually the person whose information it is doesn't see that, isn't part of that process, isn't privy to it, isn't using that information as part of their behavior change or part of their journey or trajectory. So as you start to ask questions, then you can flip it and say, well, actually, you know, a different kind of practice that actually challenges or disrupts our logics about who holds information, about the dynamics of the relationship there, that would be a transformative practice. So simply digitizing our existing systems and retaining all of the current ways of thinking, those are small practices that can be deeply harmful because they just more and more encrust us in the current ways of approaching things. But small practices that have the courage to call into question who it's for and what it's for, those are things that can be highly transformative.
Yeah, and I think you know, maybe to add to it, just being inside of the system, some of the telltale signs or the signals or characteristics or traits or whatever that might help to differentiate is how is a small change also being instigated? Like what data are you drawing from? What person's responsible? What method are you applying? What process are you enacting, and so on? If that all resembles the way things are currently managed now, change and adaptation, then it's probably just reinforcing the status quo. You know, I don't know. I think, you know, one of the things we've learned is, you know, especially when you're talking about the accumulation of these changes, is does it produce a system hardship? Like, does it, you know, Sarah uses the language of sort of contesting or fundamentally interrogating. Does it present sort of an existential incompatibility or a threat to the system? Or is it easily accommodated? Like, is this just a quick sort of fix in the system to bring that in? We've talked sometimes about the language of requiring a second operating system, like a new sensibility, a new logic, a new purpose, in order to run that new change or that new adaptation, and maybe looking at you know, how involved are the people you're supporting or serving, like how important in our case are, you know, people with disabilities and families, and co-designing it, because, you know, the less that they're involved, then the more likely we're just creating a system adaptation. And that also goes probably for people outside of the agency. I mean, what's been critical for us at Possibilities is bringing in with Forward, is being spending time in community with you know, different people with new inputs, new points of views, new imperatives, and ultimately, I think as well. And while this might take a while for the fruits of this to show, I mean, ultimately, this is about better lives for people we're supporting. Otherwise, we are just dealing with a technocratic change. And so, you know, if I'm to hazard a guess, I think that most of the measurement systems in place right now that we're using are counting outputs rather than outcomes. And so, if we're really kind of stretching into realms sort of, you know, flourishing and personal realization and identity and community resiliency and capacity and culture and those sorts of things, then it should stump the current measurement system. It should sort of create a need for looking at things a little differently, for doing something, for evaluating differently. And if there isn't any need to rethink your measurement system, then again, probably you're just in the province of status quo.
Thanks, Gord. So a question about the stretches. The book talks about stretches as a way to work. So for those people on the call trying to change large legacy systems and the knowledge that this can be nearly impossible to overcome, can you explain what you mean by stretches in the book, and how would you suggest working with them?
Sure. Gord, also please help and jump in. You know, I think one of our realizations a couple of years into our collaboration was that we were positioning the new things that we were trying to bring about too much in contrast to the old things sometimes, that we were creating these binaries between things, that the old is bad and the new is better. And we found ourselves falling into this consistent trap of the either or. And the either or way of thinking in our world has led us in many ways to where we are today. I mean, I'd say the either or binary thinking is a hallmark of modern Western thought, and kind of positivist empirical ways of thinking, to say that there is one right way and one wrong way. and it's deeply, again, deeply encoded in our language, in the ways in which we conceptualize things. And actually the space in between is the fruitful space. That's the spaces we can reclaim that for creativity, for discernment, for options. And when we simply say we're moving from the old to the new, everybody come with us, not only do we leave folks behind, but we also fail to recognize context and situation and all of the grayness that is really, you know, the key to working with humans. And so if you're going to design a human system that is human, you've got to allow actually for tension and ambiguity and some contradiction, because those are parts of us. And when we have systems that swing from one thing to the other, that's where the brittleness comes from. And we started to get increasingly concerned that even though the values behind our work were very much about human flourishing and enabling that sort of stuff, that didn't mean that safety, for instance, was unimportant. It didn't mean that we could completely leave that behind either. There is absolutely a time and place for which we need to be thinking about safety and security. The challenge is when that is it, when we are stuck in a safety and security mindset, which our systems are. And so how do we entertain the plausibility of stretching towards flourishing and enabling all that space in between? And that actually is what, you know, how fabulous to create a new way of working and a new way of being that could be more agile and flexible and capable of stretching rather than simply shifting from one thing to the other.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add to that. I think, as Sarah sort of said, we experience ourselves as contradictions. I mean, this is what the human existence, the human experience is: contrary drives, needs, purposes, motivations, all those sorts of things, and it certainly produces human angst. But we don't allow it in our systems, and yet, you know, the sorts of the scale of the challenges that we face are quite complex. And complexity isn't linear, it isn't straightforward. It consists of paradox and mystery. And so if we adopt a single lens that our system supplies us to kind of get into that complexity, it's going to be wholly inadequate, and it's probably going to be quite blunt and harmful in the process. And so we're kind of curious about this question: is can the system manage to hold tension as a lens, like as multiple purposes, multiple points of view, as a way of actually appreciating and honoring the complexity of people and the challenges that we face? And will that give us better traction and less harm?
Thank you both. So I think it's almost time now, and I just wanted to remind everyone, if you have a question for Sarah or Gord that you would like answered during the Q&A, you can just pop it in the chat, and we'll take a look at it. In a minute or two, we are going to be dividing up into groups of 3 or 4 for 8 to 10 minutes. Are we thinking 10 minutes, Amanda? 10 minutes. To talk about one of the stretch questions. So Sarah, can you explain the question that we'll be talking about in the breakout rooms?
Absolutely. So the book introduces 12 stretches that we're hoping to create space for in our systems and in ourselves. And the first stretch is the one I mentioned, safety and flourishing. How do we hold both? And one of the questions that we ask is, how do we use vulnerability as a force of social change rather than as a worrisome susceptibility that emphasizes that people are unsafe? And vulnerability is one of those words, and I'm really curious in your breakout groups for you to talk about, where does vulnerability show up in your work? How do you use that language and that concept or that category? Certainly, you know, in our experience in the social care system, and increasingly so, I'd say, vulnerability is being used as a label to demarcate a group of people that need help. You know, if you look up the definition of vulnerability, to be vulnerable is to be capable of being physically or emotionally wounded. And all of us share that capability. In fact, that's one of the great similarities that across all cultures, across all lived experiences and walks of life, we are all equally vulnerable. That is what it means to be human, is in many ways is to be vulnerable, to have that capability to both love and be hurt. And so when we start to use vulnerability as a kind of scarlet letter to indicate or demarcate that some people are in need of something, I think it can really serve to separate us rather than to find our kind of common humanity. And really what I think we mean when we talk about people being vulnerable is that our structure, that they're trapped in structures and systems and relationships that are perpetuating harm for them, that are not providing the kind of resources they need to help live into their vulnerability. And so really it's a statement about the structures and systems, not about the person. And yet vulnerable persons as language ascribes vulnerability as a fault, as a problem to fix for the person. And so, you know, Brene Brown, for those of you that like her work are familiar with it, you know, really popularized in 2010 in her TED Talk, the notion that vulnerability is a strength, that it is core to leadership, that it is core to overcoming shame, and that, you know, we're all, uncertainty and risk and exposure are part and parcel to it. And so what would it look like if our systems could reimagine vulnerability as something that, again, is a shared human condition? What it would look like if our systems, and particularly our leaders and those in power, also showed up with vulnerability, and we didn't just see vulnerability as something for those that were disadvantaged? And how could our language and our systems of thought kind of start to change if we were to move in that direction? So I think that's the question we were curious in your groups to start to talk about, and just to reflect on the way in which vulnerability shows up in your particular part of the world.
So if I could get Amanda or Tiziana to put the question in the chat so everyone has it, and we'll just say that one more time. How do we use vulnerability as a force of social change rather than as a worrisome susceptibility that emphasizes that people are unsafe? So you'll be placed into a room randomly by Amanda, and we will pull you back after 10 minutes. So Amanda, whenever you're ready, you can take us away. Oh, just one moment. Oh, great. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Everyone's coming back into the room. I hope you had a good time with your groups. Would anyone like to share what their group talked about, or maybe some insights that they took away?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Abdul Hamid. Actually, you can see my name is Matthew Johnson, but this is the name I think of the guy who set up the phone for me. One of my colleagues in the Multicultural Center, anyway. So it's still, I keep his name because I like this guy.
That's all good.
I was just talking about vulnerability. So I was telling her that I work in the Multicultural Association as settlement worker, and we deal. It is a number of organizations for settlement of newcomer, immigrant, and refugee, and definitely we can see a lot of vulnerability this kind of population had. You're forced to leave your country. You come here with nothing, and this put you in very difficult situation. You came to country with, even you cannot communicate in their language. You need to spend many years to pick up in English or French. You used to do some work back home, which you cannot do here. And you need to be on social assistance, which, as we mentioned, and one of you, I think, mentioned in the beginning, it gives you only the very basic need. For I was giving her example, for example, if you like single person, it used to be they give you a not working, the financial assistance, you can get like 650, and to get room in any place about 500, 550. So you can make the math, and it left you with $100 or $150 for everything the rest of the month. I think it increased a bit recently, but what I'm saying is that it is a lot of problem here, it put you in very difficult situation. Most of the time they have no idea about the service available for them, how to access the service because of communication problem. And even when they access any type of the service, Most of them, they want to deal with them with the Western culture mentality. But if you Asian or African or Somali or Egyptian, maybe they have different culture. So it's not only you need to be culturally competent to know about them, but you need also, I like the term they start using recently, culture humility. You need to know that everyone come here with his own culture, which is very rich culture. So try to learn from them, not only to understand his culture, just to know what is his culture. Maybe his culture teach you something. So you need to acknowledge your own culture and acknowledge other people's culture. And when you deal with them, you need to reach them through their own culture. Because culture, religion, a lot of things affect how we think, how we uh, live in this life. So it is very difficult to come to me, okay, forget your culture, forget this. Let's start from beginning. Now you in Western country, you need to have Canadian culture, you need to have Canadian language, either English or French. You need to be in the Canadian system. You need to follow. It's not, it's impossible. So if you bring these people, you're putting them in very vulnerable position because you're trying to force them to change a lot. And this will actually give them more problem than if you, the best way you acknowledge their culture and see what is good for them to keep it, and they can add to it, but recognize and acknowledge this culture. So you can help them to settle better. But if you try to brainwash them and remove everything from your mind, remove your culture, your religion, your language, let's start from beginning. It's completely
Hmm.
not fair. You cannot do this
Yeah.
to someone. It's this is
Yeah.
uh, the thing.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you very much. I just noticed the time. We are quickly coming to the end of our session, so I think we'll jump right into our Q&A. I know Jason asked a great question, the love question, as we called it. He added some context about how culturally they tend to hold back a bit emotionally. And imagine how people would react if you started talking about love. So his question is, how do we stretch the thinking of his staff teams and other organizations and commissioners to think about love in how we provide and commission services?
Lovely question, Jason, and one I perhaps with some sense of. I spent 6 years in the UK during my PhD and the first pieces of work there, and so there are some cultural differences in terms of expressions of it, perhaps. But I think the experience of it, I think, is very human and common. We just may have different ways of showing it, or how we've drawn boundaries around what is appropriate or professional. So, starting by asking some of those questions. In some of the work that we did in the UK, some of my favorite moments were when we brought people who were really unusual together. So we bringing folks, social workers, and folks that had been in the system for many years that they'd always seen as a client, but bringing them together for a dinner where the relational dynamic wasn't one of client and worker or expert and worker. And so you intentionally set up a space where you didn't need to import or bring in that. You were coming in as equals, as conversation partners or dinner mates or those sorts of things. And how in those settings that provides fodder for some really good reflection and reflexivity of when we change the names of things, when we change what we call our roles, how does that change the language we use, the questions we ask, the ways in which we listen, what we're listening for. And so, how can you use these kinds of moments to start to build up a repertoire of what does it feel like to be engaging in that way? And generally, my experience when we create these kinds of disruptive moments is that folks feel much more liberated and free, that that actually feels very constraining to have to always be thinking as a worker. That actually is a false divide. And so when you can loosen that for a moment and begin to think about how would we start to bring in a different set of boundaries and borders between our relationships and roles, that can be one step to having that conversation at least.
Yeah, it's a great question too, and I know that there is like a growing body of research that does look at things like the role of love and social care and relational ethics and other sorts of things that tries to reset relationships from sort of transactional ones where you're fulfilling a role for a certain purpose or end that is usually articulated by a system, to entering into the mystery kind of a relationship, which actually comes probably with different sets of imperatives. And I mean, in some ways, I think systems have done a really disservice by not allowing people to show up as their full selves and requiring them to show up in particular roles. I think there's also some real moral and ethical difficulties that presents, or challenges that presents, and harm that presents, not only to the people we're supporting, but to ourselves as practitioners. And but knowing as well, though, that love, I think, can be a profoundly destabilizing force for systems, because when love makes its own requirements of you, the relationship that you have with that person places its own demands, and you have to respond to that. And that moral act, or that love act, can sometimes fly in the face of what systems are requiring you to do or expected to do, and so on. It's unpredictable, of course, in those moments, because those are deeply contextual moments and deeply relational moments. And systems require more predictability and consistency. So all this sort of say is, I don't know how easy or how ready it's going to be to retrofit systems to incorporate love now as sort of a new legitimate kind of dynamic. At the same time, there's a thirst for it, and there's a readiness, I think, and there's an opportunity there.
So we are quickly coming to a close. Thank you, Gord and Sarah. One last question for you both. What message of hope can you give to those trying to change legacy structures and cultures?
I think the feeling that Gord and I have after all of these years of doing it and trying to it is, it's really hard, it's really exhausting, and there are all sorts of moments where you see these kind of glimmers of different things emerging and happening. And so I think, per the earlier question around paying attention to the interaction level and recognizing how we might create change that feels, perhaps small. It's a change in the way in which language is getting used, or the conversations that are happening between people, or what they're asking about or seeing, but recognizing and validating all of those moments as inherently valuable. And that if we can create more of those and accumulate those, that hopefully creates those tipping points. So I think some of it is, all of us, I think, who work in this space are also aspirational and ambitious. And the act of reimagining our social safety nets and turning them into trampolines is enormous. It requires deconstructing and unpacking everything that we've thought we've known is true. So that can feel so daunting. But if we can also start to hold that ambition whilst also rooting it in everyday moments and interactions, I think that is that's where we can see some hopefulness.
Yes, I completely echo that. And I sometimes think about it as like, we're kind of, there's a whole bunch of little things that we do, and sometimes we disregard moments as actually critical precipitants or of change. And it might feel like you don't get a grand impact or a grand outcome, but it feels like, just the aggregation of all this energy that is going into something more beautiful, better, more meaningful, that energy doesn't kind of get lost. And today, we're facing COVID-19 and racial inequities, which I think are two forces that are creating instabilities in systems. And we know that, you know, systems will, as you know, we said in the book, they all have expiry dates. And so, you know, I think there's also a lot of Canadians who want to rethink and reimagine what it means to be Canadian and what sort of social contract we want. So I think there's a confluence of a number of you know, things that can give us hope. And I also think hope should be our natural state anyways, because one of my favorite philosophers talks about how you know, hope is refusing to be seduced by despair, because that, you know, we to be in many ways in sort of is sorry, I'm totally thrashing this, but hope is what liberates us from our captivity. And when we can't achieve sort of the fullness of our own being, it's hope that kind of you know, emancipates us. And so I think we should hold on to hope irrespective of what the odds are.
Thank you, Gord. So the final question for our Mentimeter, one word that best describes what you are taking from this session. A lot of vulnerability, love, stretching, care. It's not either or. So I'd like to mention the book, Trampoline Effect. Amanda will pop the website where you can grab a copy. If you're local to Fredericton and are interested in purchasing a copy, we might be putting in a bulk order. So please reach out to us and we can help you with that. And one final thing, drawing the book. Let's see if someone is online. Gord or Sarah, do you want to pick a number for me?
22.
22. Do we have a Corey Herc on the line? Corey? Nope.
Corey's not on the call, but he's well known in the community, and I'm sure the book would be very helpful for him, and I'm sure he's going to listen to the recording.
I see a bunch of people nodding, so great.
All the Moncton
Awesome.
folks to know Corey.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. We know everyone is very busy approaching Christmas. Grab your copy of the Trampoline Effect. Amanda has popped the website. You can get it direct from the website. There's lots of booksellers who are selling it. Support local if you can. Any questions, let us know. Thank you, Gord and Sarah, for your time and sharing your insights,
Thank you, everyone.
and to
Thanks
everyone
so
for
much.
joining.
Yeah, thanks for a great conversation.